Okay, welcome everyone. We'll give folks a few minutes to join us and then we'll go ahead and get started with our third session today. Feel free to say hi in the session chat so we know you're here, and we'll get started in a few minutes. If you're just joining us now, welcome. Welcome everyone. Feel free to say hi in the chat and we'll get started in a couple minutes. Hello everyone, welcome. We'll get started in maybe 1 or 2 more minutes. Feel free to introduce and say hi in the chat. We'll wait for everyone to join us and then we'll go ahead and get started with the third session today. All right, awesome. Well, welcome everyone. If more folks come in, that's great, but let's go ahead and get started with the third session. So today we're talking about how to compose the right experience for the right audience, including some common mistakes and best practices. So we're going to explore some intermediate settings, some common errors, and also review some best practices for composer configuration. And this session is really meant to build upon the previous sessions that we've done together. So we're going to create a more complex experience build, and still sort of give you time to practice in that test environment that we've been using. So our goals for today are a little bit more expanded, right? We have a few more objectives for today, and this is because we're building on what we've already learned. So by the end of this session, you should be able to understand and avoid some common mistakes when building out your composer experiences. You should also be able to create a more complex experience with multiple user segment cards, multiple page metering options and settings, and different action cards in Composer as well. I also want you to be able to organize your Composer experiences a little bit better and use some various naming conventions and best practices to do that. And we'll also be setting up an A/B split test in an experience today so that you can practice that. And then we've already talked a little bit about this, but you should also be able to understand the difference between a live experience and an active version. And then finally, we're also going to talk about monitoring or listening experiences, so experiences that don't actually execute any actions on site, but the benefits of those. So that's everything that we're going to cover today. And in terms of our agenda, I'm going to start with a demo and spend a significant amount of time on the demo, but really this is an opportunity for you to sort of watch, pay attention. I'll talk about the different things that I'm doing as I'm setting it up, and then we'll come back and I'll share some slides about essentially what I did, why I did it, some things that could have gone wrong, and how to avoid those things. Then you'll have an opportunity to practice on your own, and then we'll finish up with a presentation, a couple slides around the monitoring experiences or listening experiences. So that's our agenda for today. And like I said, I'm going to start with a demo. So let me go ahead and stop sharing this screen, and then I will share my other screen so that you can see what I'm doing in the piano dashboard. Okay. All right, so this is the same environment that we've been using, the same practice environment here. And I'm just going to build out a new Composer experience. So I'm going to come into Composer. I love seeing everybody's live experiences here, so hopefully that was fun being able to build and test and preview those on site. So today, essentially, I want to build a more complex Composer experience. So previously, we set up a basic Composer experience that really just sort of triggered one offer on site for one segment of users. But today, I'm going to practice setting up a metered paywall experience. And this paywall experience is going to target anonymous users and registered users with different offers. And as a part of that, I also maybe, as an example, have a theory that my registered users, so my users who have an account but maybe don't pay for a paid subscription, I think that of those users, the ones who come from my email newsletter campaign, so coming from a referral source of my email, I think that those users are going to be more likely to subscribe to a paid offer if I present them with slightly different messaging. So I also want to set up an A/B split test in this experience to test that, right? To show this different messaging to those users who are coming from that email referral source. So to get started, I'll click Compose. I'm going to set up a new site page view experience. I'm going to use that same naming convention. And I could give it a description here. This is a great way of sort of organizing your experiences, especially if you're working in an environment where multiple people on your team are working. So rather than just relying on a naming convention or something like that, you can really describe what's going on here. So everything that I just said about building a metered paywall experience that targets anonymous and registered users with different offers and including an A/B split test for the email referrals, right? All of that information I could include here in this description. But for the purposes of this demo, I won't make you watch me type it out, just noting that that's one way of sort of organizing and sharing information about your experiences as you set them up. All right, so we'll go ahead and create this. And again, we've already reviewed sort of how to look at this canvas, setting up the where, the who, the when, the what. So for this experience, I'm going to just start the same way that I would always start with the where. and go ahead and edit the effective pages card here. So I need to turn off the target all pages in order to be able to edit these settings. So for this example, again, I want to set up a metered paywall experience for my registered and my anonymous users. So this could be, depending on how my site is configured, any combination of these settings. I'm really going to focus on the URL settings here so that I can trigger this on my demo site and show it to you all. But really, if you pass things like tags or content author or content section to Piano, if you pass that information to Piano, you can target based on that. I also wanted to note this setting down here is a sort of newer addition, but you can also target based on publish time, which we haven't talked about yet. But if there's, specific pages on your site that you want to include or exclude based on their age, you can do that here. So I don't need that for this demo, but I wanted to highlight that these settings exist. And I'm going to start by using some wildcards, and I'll talk a little bit more about how these can be used and why. But essentially within this URLs section, I'm going to say that I want any sort of sample, right? Again, this is just my demo, but this could be any of the pages that you want your paywall or your registration wall to appear, your content lock to appear. So I'm going to target these sample pages, and these URLs, these asterisks, these wildcard URLs that I'm using here really mean anything that comes before this in the URL and anything that comes after. So if sample, right, if this series of characters is anywhere within the URL, then include it in this case, right? Or I could exclude. Oops. I could exclude with the drop down, right? And change that from include to exclude. Because I also mentioned that I want to be targeting traffic coming from my email campaign. In this case, I have a UTM campaign set up to track those users who click from an email and then come to my site. So I know that I can include that in the page targeting here. You won't necessarily need to do that if you're setting up your own composer experience that targets email referrers, because as you'll see later on, I have that option available for targeting in the user segment card as well. But for this, if I want to be able to trigger this experience and show you, I need to include that UTM campaign in the URL rules to be able to trigger it on my demo site. So just for demo purposes, I can actually copy and paste rather than having to write out the whole UTM campaign equals this and the medium equals this and the source equals that. I can just copy and paste that whole string. Again, I'm using these wildcards to say that this can appear anywhere within the URL. So anything before or anything after. And you have to hit enter in order for it to appear in the targeting logic here. So that's all I really need for this demo, but I did want to point out some more logic that occurs here that might not be intuitive at first glance. So I'm only using one box here, right? One category, but we do have this all of, any one of toggle here. And this is essentially and logic and or logic. But this toggle only applies in between the boxes. So it doesn't really matter if I'm just using one box, but if I'm using multiple boxes, so for example, if I also say that I want to include pages that are tagged with premium, this matters, right? So with this setting, I have said any pages that include sample anywhere in the URL, or any pages that include this UTM string anywhere in the URL, and, right, all of, and the pages also have to be tagged with premium. So they have to meet these criterias and this criteria, right? If I were to switch this to any one of, which is my or logic, it could be this or this or this. So a page tagged with premium that did not meet the URL criteria would still be included, would still meet the criteria for this page card. So it's or logic within the boxes, unless you have something like you want to exclude the home page, for example, or you want to exclude the subscribe page. right? These are always and. So it's any pages that have sample anywhere in the URL and or this UTM string anywhere in the URL, but never the home page and never the subscribe page. So it's or unless you have an exclude within the box. And in this toggle applies to the logic between the boxes if you are using multiple categories. So this is really all I need for this demo, but I wanted to explain that because it appears elsewhere as well, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So for now, that's all I need. I'll go ahead and click the check mark to save that setting. And then from here, I can move on to my user segment card. I'll go in and edit this. And the first thing I want to do is actually give this card a name, right? I don't just want, because in this example, I know I'm going to be setting up multiple user segment cards. I actually want to make sure that I've labeled them correctly. So this is going to be my anonymous users, right? And in this card, I'm going to say, okay, I'm targeting a custom segment. And if I go into account properties, I can do that by saying that these users are unregistered or logged out, right? Those are my anonymous users. If they're not logged in, I don't know who they are. So that's probably the sort of fastest, easiest way to target your anonymous users. We did talk a little bit about setting up resources to represent your registration terms and things like that. So you certainly could say that these are users who, don't have access to a resource that represents registration, which would mean that they're unregistered, right? But one thing I wanted to note is that in certain instances, right, depending on your configuration, how your templates are created, there might be ways in which a user could create a login without getting access to that registration resource. So for example, if they start the checkout process for a paid subscription and they create a login, right, and they, set their username and password, but they never complete that checkout process, they now have a login, but they don't actually have access to any resources. Or maybe they say, in some templates, there's a link at the bottom that says, if you already have an account, sign in here, or create your account here. So depending on what you have set up, just note that users might have a login, but might not have access to a registration resource. So you should sort of decide what makes the most sense for your business, depending on how it's set up. In this case, I know I can just target anonymous users by saying that they are unregistered or logged out. And that's really all I need to do for this card, right? I've given it a name so that I can easily identify it from this view. And in reporting and for troubleshooting. So this is really helpful for a number of reasons, right? Like I said, in reports, it makes things a lot easier. For troubleshooting, if you're investigating something on the site, which we'll be doing next in the next session. So this is a good best practices to give these cards a name so that at a high level, you can always see how this card is configured, because you do get the summary, but maybe it's helpful to give it a name as well. So at this point, I kind of have two options. I can continue building out this segment, right, this branch, or I could go and build out my other user segments. I'm going to finish what I started and complete what I want to happen for my anonymous users, and then I'll go ahead and build my secondary and tertiary user branches. So for this one, for my anonymous users, this is a metered paywall experience, so I need a page view meter. So again, I'm going to give this card a title, and this is going to be my anonymous meter. And then we have to give it a meter name, right? Because this is the default. And what this means is the meter name is its unique identifier. This is its ID, right? This matters. This is what says this meter is different from another meter executing in a different experience, or another meter executing within the same experience, which I will have in this sample. So for this one, I want to make sure that this one is called the anonymous meter, or some other, we may have some other complex naming scheme here, but just note that this is its identifier, right? Its unique ID. And this matters because if you have two meters that have the same meter name, right, the same identifier, they will increment the same, right, at the same rate. And I'll explain what that means as I create my other meters. But note that this one I want to be separate. the other meter cards that I include in this experience will have the same meter name so that they do increment at the same rate. But this one I want only to be applicable to my anonymous users. And for my anonymous users, I'm really going to limit what they have. They get 1 page view per month. Typically, I would recommend turning on this meter unique pages only. But for my demo, I'm going to turn it off because essentially what I want to be able to do is trigger the meter by refreshing the page. Usually that's not the best user experience, right? You don't want a user to accidentally trigger the meter just because they refreshed, or maybe they were reading and then they came back to the same page later and they got the meter and they couldn't finish reading. So in most cases, this is turned on. And then this other setting for not metering traffic from incoming referrals. This is sometimes useful if you pay for ads on Facebook or something like that, and you're directing traffic to your site. Maybe you don't want to immediately hit those users with a paywall or reg wall. So we can turn this off for now, but some publishers, some clients like to exclude certain referrals from the meter. So that's all I need for my anonymous meter. And you can see once I've created this card, I'm now prompted, and on my canvas, I now have an additional meter value card. So this is where I could define things like essentially various actions. Maybe in this case, it's only they get 1 page view per month. So there's not a lot else I want to do except for when the meter has expired, I want to show them an offer. But if I had a longer meter, maybe I want to show them a reminder at certain number of page views, right? So if they get 6 page views per month, maybe I want to show them a reminder at 3, or maybe I want to show them a reminder, starting at 2 and every second page view, something like that. So you can configure this in different ways to trigger different messaging. But for now, I just need it to say that when it has expired, I will show them an action. And in this case, my action is going to be a show offer, because on these pages for my anonymous users, after they've read a page view per month, I want to show them an offer that includes the option to register or subscribe. So I need my show offer card to trigger the checkout or the registration process. I need to select an offer, and I'll find sort of standard one here. This one includes registration, a monthly and a yearly subscription. So they have the option to register for free or pay to subscribe. And then I really don't need to worry about any of these other settings for now. All I need to do is select my template. And for this, I'm probably just going to choose a standard, maybe a decoy. This template looks good. I can use the standard one, not the new messaging, although I use that later. And then again, I'm going to show it as a modal, a lightbox, something that pops up over the content, and I'm not going to allow users to close it because this is a paywall, reg roll. So I want them to take an action with this template before they can continue reading. All right, so now I have my first branch. Let me pause for questions. Carolina, you can let me know if there's any questions in the chat and I can go back.
The only question that was posed is actually already responded, so you can move forward.
Awesome. Okay, so now that I have my first user segment branch and I know what I'm doing with them, I'm going to create a second user segment branch. And I will just add a new segment. There's a couple other options here, and I'll talk more about these later. Another way of doing this is sort of dragging and dropping this user segment card onto the canvas, but you can see here I have this plus sign option available, so I'll just add a new segment. And this segment, again, the first thing I want to do is name it. It's also helpful as you're creating it to remember what it is that you're trying to do here. So this segment is going to be my registered no access segment, right? These are users who are, unlike the previous segment, they are logged in, they are registered, but they don't have paid access, right? They don't have a premium subscription, they didn't subscribe. So in order to do that, I'll say that these are logged in users with no access to certain resources. So maybe that's the premium content and the standard content, something like that. And again, we have our fun little logic toggle. If any of you have ever set up a composer experience like this, I'm sure that this has given you at least a little bit of trouble. The best way to think about it is and or, right? Same as in the pages card, same as anywhere else it appears here. All of is and, any one of is or. So what this means, it gets a little tricky when we talk about having no access to. And I think it's especially if you're an English speaker, because the way you would read this is these users have no access to all of these resources, or these users have no access to any one of these resources, which when you read it, those mean the same thing. But the way you have to think about it is and or. So in this case, with this setting to and, these users, in order to meet the criteria for this card, right, in order for Composer to say, yes, these users pass and they can go on to the next stage, these users have no access to this resource and no access to this resource. So that's what this is looking for. This box, because we're looking at the has no access to, only cares about what they have no access to. It doesn't actually care what they have access to. So in this case, this is how I want this setting. But if I were to change this to be any one of, right, to be or, Composer is now looking for users who have no access to this resource or who have no access to this resource. So if I'm a user and I'm logged in and I come and I don't have access to the premium content, but I do have access to the standard content, I actually meet the criteria of this card, right? Because I don't have access to at least one of these, right? I don't have access to whatever I just said, premium or standard. So even if I have access to one, it doesn't matter because it's only looking at what they have no access to. So just be really mindful when you're setting these things up that this is toggled the right way. And always it's a good idea to test. But in this instance, this is how I want it set up. I want to make sure that these are users who are logged in, but they don't have access to this resource and they don't have access to this resource, right? They have no premium paid subscriber access. They're just registered users. So that might be it that I need for this card, except what I know I'm going to do later is create a user segment for my users that have come from my email campaign. And because I'm going to do that, I actually want to make sure that this user segment is exclusive from that user segment. So I want to make sure that they don't overlap, because otherwise you get into a situation where Composer might be trying to show two things at the same time. So I'm going to try to make these as exclusive as possible. And the way I'm going to do that is by coming into browsing properties, finding my UTM section, and I'm actually going to ignore the users that are coming from a certain UTM campaign that I've targeted, right? Both in my page targeting and that I know I'm going to target in another user segment. So for this, let's see, I need to ignore a specific campaign. So this is going to be campaign. The source is piano and the medium is email. Oops. There we go. So this is now ignoring the UTM campaign that meets these criteria, so that it can be exclusive from the segment that will include users that are coming from this UTM campaign. And UTM campaigns are great. They're sort of, universal depending on your email service provider. So I've generated mine with Piano ESP, but it's not exclusive to Piano ESP. So if you use another email service provider, you may be able to generate these UTM campaigns, which allow you to track traffic coming from your email onto your website. So it's a helpful tool for tracking that type of referral. Okay, Now, that's what I need for this next user segment. So again, here I could create a copy of this card and duplicate it here for my next user segment and say that I actually want to include, those users coming from this campaign. But what I'm actually going to wait to do is I'm going to build out this whole segment, and then I'm going to copy that card and everything after that card, because the next user segment branch that I create is going to be virtually the same, except that's where I want to run my A/B split test. So for now, I'll continue on with this branch, and then I'll go in and show you a little bit of a shortcut as you're building out multiple branches in your experience. So I have my anonymous meter. Now I need my registered meter, right? So my registered users, they've registered. I want to give them a little bit extra, right? I maybe want to give them more than just one page view a month. So I actually need another page view meter card. And again, in this case, this is my reg meter, right? This is different from my anonymous user meter. So it needs to have a different name. And I'll give it a different title of the card too, so that I can see that it's different from my anonymous meter. And this is important because if a user, imagine the full user journey, right? Imagine you're an anonymous user, you come to the site, you get your one free page view, then you register for a free account. If this had the same name, and let's say it's 3 page views, if this had the same name, right? If this was still the anonymous meter, then you've already used up one of your page views, right? You're coming to this new page view meter, but you've already used one of your pages. So by giving it a different name, you're sort of resetting that meter, right? This is a totally separate meter. It's going to increment separately. So now as a non-anonymous user, I get 3 additional page views, right? I can, have the one that I had as an anonymous user, and now I can have 3 additional ones as a registered user. And there's different ways of doing that, right? Maybe if this was the same, I could just say, okay, we'll give them 4 page views. It's essentially saying the same thing. But depending on how you want to track it, I find it's better to sort of keep them separate if they really are for sort of separate audiences, separate meters. But it's useful to know, and really it's a decision you have to make depending on how you want things to function on your site, how you want to track things, how you want the user experience to be set up, because it might be useful in some cases to have the same meter across multiple different experiences, or across different user segment branches within an experience. So just be conscious that this is how you would control that functionality, is with the unique identifier, which is its name. All right, again, if this were real, I might turn this on, but I'll leave it off for now so that I can automatically increment the meter by refreshing the page. And I'll go ahead and say that's good. Now, again, I have my meter value card here, which I didn't name in the previous card, but again, I recommend sort of giving this a name. So this might be the meter value is expired for anonymous users. Maybe you have some sort of complex naming strategy here to keep track of all these cards, but it can be helpful to even give this card a name. But for this one, again, I don't need to worry about when it increments or showing something when it equals a certain number of page views. I'm not going to set up any sort of reminder messaging here. I'm just going to say, when it expires, show them an offer. And for this, I don't want to show them an offer that includes the registration option, right? Because they've already registered. So I don't want to show them another option to register. That would be silly. I just want to show them, the monthly and the yearly subscription option, right? Now they have to pay. And I'll go ahead and select my template. Okay. And again, hard paywall. They're not going to be able to close it. So that's good for that one. All right. Now that I have this branch all set up, right? These are registered users who don't have paid access, so they're going to get an additional 3 page views a month, and then they'll be shown an option to register or pay rather. So what I want to test, again, as I have a theory that of the registered users, the ones that are coming from my email newsletter are going to be more likely to subscribe if I customize the messaging a little bit in this offer, right? So I want to test that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this card and all of its children, which means this card and every other card that comes after this card. So I'm going to copy the card and the children, and I'm going to paste the card and the children below. So now I have two identical user segment branches, right, within my experience, and they do the exact same thing. But what I need to do is edit this one to say, this is actually my registered users from my email or my UTM or however I want to say it, right? Right, these are my users that are logged in, they don't have paid access, and instead of ignoring, I'm going to say these users have to have come from this UTM campaign, from this email code, right? So again, that's why I made the previous segment ignore these same criteria, because I want to make sure that they're exclusive. So in the previous segment, it has to not be people who came from this campaign. In this segment, it is only people who came from this campaign. And I've named it differently so that I can distinguish it easily and quickly from my just simple registered no access versus my registered no access and the users that came from the UTM campaign. Okay, so I still need my test at this point, right? Because at this point, I'm still just showing these two user groups the same offer with the same messaging and all that. But what I want to test is the messaging in this offer, right? Maybe I don't even want to test the terms that I'm giving them. I really just want to test the messaging and see that if I customize it, are they more likely to subscribe? So what I need now is an A/B split test. So I will drag and drop, and you can see I have a couple options for where to put it, but because I want to test the offer, I will put it in front of the show offer card for this branch. Again, give it a name. Right, I'm testing these users that are coming from this UTM campaign. You can name it whatever you want, but again, something clear that you can easily look at and say, oh, right, that's what I set this up for. If this is the first time you're doing it, you get these helpful little tooltips, which can be a good idea to read through. And you can see there's also some hover over info here as well. So a lot of this is documented heavily in our doc site. So you can always click and reference the documentation as you're setting this up if you have questions. But for now, this is going to be a page view level split test, and I have to select my key performance indicator, right? My KPI. I have to say, how am I going to measure the success of this test? Is it based on the conversion rate, the number of conversions? Maybe I'm really just testing different templates and they're not even offer templates. So I want to see how frequently users close the template, the closure rate, or the number of clicks. So you have a lot of different options to choose from here. I'll leave it on conversion rate and say, I could say, straight up just conversions or conversion rate. For now, I'll just say conversion rate. And then I can choose the time that I want my test to run, and whether I want it to automatically complete after it has significance. There's plenty of best practices around how to set up split tests like this in our best practices site, so I recommend taking a look at those. Typically, the longer you run a test, the more data you have. It really depends on the size of your site, how much traffic you have. So it's a good idea to take some of these things into consideration as you're setting up your test. But for now, I'll just leave that as is. And then here I can choose my branches for my test, right? This is going to be my no impact branch where nothing actually happens. My control, where I can choose the original messaging that I want to show users that I'm already showing users who did not come from the email campaign. And then right? And then my test where I want to see, okay, of the traffic that came from my UTM referral source, I want to show them separate messaging. So maybe I'm going to give that, right? Maybe this is old messaging, new messaging, so that I can easily see the difference, right, of what I'm testing here. And then once your test is actually live, you'll be able to see additional metrics. Right now I'm just sort of setting up the test. My experience isn't live, so I can't see any of the sort of reporting associated with this. But once you set it up and it's live and there's data coming in, you can always come back into the test to sort of measure its progress. And you can add additional variants, right? It doesn't have to be just the two sort of A and B. You can add additional variants, and you can divide the weights equally among the variants, so you don't have to do the math. Or maybe you want to do the math and you want to say, actually, I only want to split maybe 10% of my audience in here, and the other 90% will be with the old messaging. Just be aware, because that affects the amount of traffic that's seeing your test. But it's a good way of really honing in what you want to test and controlling who's seeing what on your site. But for this test, I really just want to say 50% is going to see the old messaging and 50% is going to see the new messaging. All right. And now I have these two branches, right? Here's my old messaging with my standard show offer, the same one that these folks are being shown up here. And now I can copy this card, paste it here. And what I'm going to do is actually just change the template, right? I'm not going to change the offer. I still want to show them the two options to subscribe. Those are the same, but I want to change the messaging. So I'm going to click to change template. And instead of selecting the standard one, I already have a variant set up, right? And this is my new messaging variant. So I'm going to select that one. And the messaging is slightly different. You can see here, maybe even in the preview, that there's slightly different messaging in this template. So I'll select that one. Okay. Again, might be a good idea to say this is the new messaging. And this is the old messaging. So again, you can quickly see, oh, okay, this is the old messaging for this 50% of the audience, and this is the new messaging. And now I have quite a bit going on here, right? I have to scroll quite a bit to get back to where I started. So again, it's another reason, and this is not even the most complex experience you could possibly have, right? Obviously, you could keep going and have lots of user segment branches, multiple A/B split tests. There's lots of things that you could do here to make this even more complicated, but this is certainly more complicated than the original experience that we built together. So I wanted to show that, but that should be everything that I need for this experience, except now I need to make sure that I have saved. And I'm going to save as a new version. I like recommending saving as a new version because it allows you to then easily go back and forth. And you can see if I go back to version 1, there's not actually anything here, right? This is just what I did when I first created the experience. I didn't save anywhere in between. It just sort of auto saves. So now if I go back into version 2, I have all of the things that I just already did, and I can activate this as the active version. This experience is not live, so having this as the active version just means that when this experience goes live, this is the one that will show, right? We talked a little bit about this already, but as you have multiple versions, it's always a good idea to double check which one is the active one, because if you're not seeing what you expect to see on site, that might be why. Now, the final step for making this experience live would be to go back out, search for my offline experience. Here it is, and would be to change the status of it to live, right? So that's the last thing I need in order for it to actually execute on site. I'm not going to save this change because I actually already have the same version, right, running in another experience. So I set it up in advance just so that I knew it would work. So I'm not going to save these changes, but when you're setting your experience up, you will. And that would be the last step. So here's my live version. Again, you can see it's pretty much exactly the same. And now let's see if it works. We can go and preview it on the site. So one thing I just wanted to note here is that we're using this question mark in the URL, and then and we're using that in the page targeting as well. This is a nifty trick, and I'm not a technical person, so I'm not going to be able to explain exactly what it's doing, but essentially it's telling the website to load everything, before the question mark in the URL. So the page is exactly the same as you would see it if you didn't have any of this. But because this is included in the URL after the question mark, Composer triggers, right? Composer, the page targeting that we have set up in Composer, sees this as a match and then runs the experience. So it doesn't change any of the actual content on the page, but it allows us to quickly sort of test and trigger Composer. So this is something you should be able to do on your test sites, on your live site, if you ever want to play around with that. It's not exclusive to this site here. All right, so that should be my first page view. This is now, so I got my one page view when I refreshed the page. Now I get the offer with the registration. So if I want to continue reading, I have to register. And I like to, when I'm creating test users, use the date. And because I'm from the US, I write the date like this. But you can write it however you like, or you have any other sort of system, but you can use this sort of appendage, right, with this plus sign after your email address to create these sort of fake emails. I have some custom fields here, but I don't think they're required, so I'll type, oh, okay. All right, now I should be able to register. Great, I now have access to free content, so I should be able to close this. And if I refresh 3 times, 1, 2, 3, and then on my next one, yep, I should get the next offer, right? In this case, I have an offer that includes like a monthly, a yearly, and a premium subscription here. So now in order to keep reading, I would need to pay for access. And because I'm not coming from the referral source, I did not get put into the A/B split test. So let's see what happens, which one I get. And this is random, right? I can't affect which one I get. And I would have to go in and clear my cookies if I wanted to get put into another branch potentially, but I do want to see what happens. So I got the same messaging, the original messaging. I didn't get put into the B, the other option for the split test. But this would be a user that meets the criteria, right? They're coming from, or the URL makes it seem like they're coming from the UTM campaign in the email. So they would meet that criteria for that user branch that we set up in Composer. Okay, and again, this is a production site, so I'm not going to go through the payment because it would ask for a real credit card. But that's everything we need to set up a metered paywall. So let me go back to stop sharing the screen and pause for questions before we move on.
We have a question done by Roxanne that says, what if you wanted to segment specific pages according to website tags? They have different subscription products, one being for data content, and they need a separate meter paywall offer for this product.
So without knowing the full extent of the setup, it's something you could absolutely do, right? So in that effective pages card, right, rather than using the URL rules that I used, you would pass the tag data to Piano and use the tags, setting in the effective pages card URL to target only those pages that are tagged in a certain way, right, according to the rules that you set up in the effective pages card in Composer. And you might need, depending on how it's set up, multiple experiences, right? If you, I'm trying to think of an example, but if you have, multiple different tags and you want to run, different experiences depending on the tag, because within that section, it's only or logic, right? So it's pages that are tagged with, sports, or pages that are tagged with fashion, or pages that are tagged with, whatever the case may be. If you wanted to have separate experiences for each of those, you might set up separate composer experiences for each of those tags in the pages card, because you can only have the one effective pages card per experience. Another thing that I've seen folks do is have a tag that represents the content that should be paywalled, right? So rather than having, right, all of the sort of content related tags, you have a tag that simply says premium content, or you have a tag that says, paywall, or whatever the tag is, right? And you make sure that all of the content that should be locked, restricted, whatever the case is tagged appropriately, and then you can use that in your targeting. So hopefully that helps.
Okay. So as a follow-up question by Roxanne,
yeah.
We have, from a technical side, does that create competing logics?
I won't know the answer to that question without sort of looking at the specific setup, but theoretically, no, if you set it up in the correct way, right? It shouldn't. Hard to answer without looking at the specifics, though.
Now, we do have a follow-up question from Michelle on the chat. It started as asking, what is the difference between expire at one page view and equals one page view? And she was asking to see if we could showcase with the demo experience that you were setting up, what would happen if we used the page view equals instead of page view expires.
I don't know. I'm looking at the time. I don't know if we have time for that during this section, but I would highly encourage you to test it on your own when we go into the practice activities, right? Setting up a meter one way and then setting up a meter another way and testing to see what the difference is. You can also check out the doc site probably for the answer to that question. But it's a good question, and definitely something I would recommend testing to see what the difference is.
No further questions, then we can move forward.
Awesome. Okay. Great. Okay. So now that we've gone through our demo, right, we sort of successfully set up a composer, a more advanced composer experience. Let's talk about some of the things that could have gone wrong, or some of the things that I did to prevent things from going wrong. And the reason I want to talk about this is because everybody makes mistakes, right? Even I didn't put the experience that I made live, right? I created a whole experience and I didn't set it live because I could have made a mistake and then it wouldn't have worked and that would have been embarrassing. But even I make mistakes, right? I'm, supposedly an expert. Everybody has those days, right? So no matter what, you should always sort of just accept that fact that you will make mistakes and then be aware of what you can do to try and avoid them in the future. Okay, so essentially I'm just going to walk through the same steps that I took in the composer experience, but I'm going to call out some specific elements that we talked about and go into a little bit more detail and just review. And if I repeat myself, that just means that it's important and that I hope you retain that information. So talk about the pages card, talk about the user segments card, the events and triggers, the actions, and then obviously the status. All right, so when setting up the effective pages card, if you are using the URLs, and the reason I spend so much time on the URLs as opposed to tags or other sections is just because this is a popular method, right? It's everybody has website URLs. Most folks have some sort of taxonomy, right? Some sort of logic behind the URL structure. So if you can identify specific pages based on that URL taxonomy, this is a great way of targeting certain pages in Composer. But obviously, yes, you could use tags, you could use content section, author, right? Any of those other things available to make more complex logic. This is just one way that is very flexible and very common. So that's why I focus on it. But one thing to note is that this difference between the absolute and the relative URL. So this really only comes into play if you have any subdomains, right? If you have some variations on your domain itself. But if the URL that we're looking at is, www.yourdomain.com with all this extra stuff afterwards, right, to identify the page, then the absolute URL is exactly that, right? It is everything, including the HTTPS, right? It is exactly that URL. But the relative URL is only the string, right? The sort of the stuff that comes after the domain in the URL. It's like this other stuff in the path. So that becomes important if you have subdomains. So if you're targeting the relative URL, it includes those subdomains as long as they meet the rest of the string. But the absolute does not, right? The absolute URL only includes that specific domain, not any subdomains. So something important to note if you have subdomains. And then I used some wildcards, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about some additional wildcard rules, because these can be used to make a really complex set of logical rules that define when your experience executes. And these work the same way if you're targeting by in other sections of Composer, so not just the URLs. You can use these wildcard rules for referrer or source in the user segmentation card, or inclusions or exclusions in the page view meter card for referrers. So it's a good thing to know sort of across the board in Composer. And the reason I talk about it here is because a little typo makes a big difference. I think you even saw me make a typo in a previous session, right, in this pages card. And that's because whatever you type in is exactly what Composer is looking at, right? It doesn't know that it's a typo. So you really have to be careful about what you enter here. So in this example, I actually have the asterisk and the question mark as special characters and as wildcard rules. So the asterisk, the one that I used in my page targeting, means any number of characters of any type, after or before. So in this example, it looks like sort of a date format, right, with these question marks, because the question marks are one specific character. So it doesn't matter which character it is, but it's one rather than any number. So this looks sort of like a date, right? It's this 4 question marks, then a dash, then 2 question marks, then another 2 question marks after the dash. It's not specifying that those are numbers. It could be letters, but assuming that you have some sort of consistent date format in your URL, this might be one way of targeting only pages that include that date without specifying the actual dates themselves, right? And this says that it has to match that sort of date format with those individual characters in that way, and it can have anything after that last dash. So that's what that asterisk means there. But in the next rule, right, in this next exclusion rule, I wanted to use the question mark as a character, not as a wildcard. So I had to use this backslash, right, this escape character in front of the question mark in order to do that. So you can do both. You can do the same thing with asterisks. If you have asterisks in your URLs and you want to use them as characters rather than wildcards, you just have to enter that backslash in front. Okay. There's also a ton of examples in our documentation site. These are super helpful if you're unclear about, well, did I set it up right? Why isn't this being included? Will this URL be included if I set it up this way? There's a ton of great examples. I just pulled a few in here so that we can take a look at them together, but I highly recommend checking out the docs and going through this chart, because basically what it does is it gives you an example. So in this case, it's, this URL pattern is /sports, but it doesn't have the asterisks, right? So it doesn't say anything can come before or anything can come after. The URL has to begin with sports, and then nothing can come after it, right? Because that's what that means. So even this URL that says, your domain /sports/Mets doesn't match, right? Like it says, it doesn't match because it has something after sports. Alternatively, if you have sports with an asterisk after it, then all of these things that have things after, like Yankees or Mets or whatever, those match because there's something that comes after it, and you've said that that's okay with the wildcard rule. Similarly for things before, right? So you can use the asterisk before instead of just after. And this is a great way, and this is how I was able to target some of my pages in my page targeting logic, use the asterisks on both sides, right? So not just at the beginning. So the first example says anything that comes before mets in the URL is included, but it can't have anything after. So it has to end with the word mets. But the second one says mets can actually be anywhere within the URL. So anything, as long as it says mets somewhere in there, is good, and it meets the criteria. And then similarly with the question mark, as opposed to the asterisk, again, the question mark is just a single character rather than any string of characters. So if you have this logic set up in the first example here, it has to just be one character. So if there's more than one character, it doesn't match. So this one question mark says there can only be a single character, so it matches if it's /1 or /s, right? Those match, but anything else doesn't. And then similarly, right, maybe this is that date format example. You can string them together and say, okay, it has to have 4 characters, then a dash, then 2 characters, then another dash, then another 2 characters, then a dash, and then anything can come after it. So the reason why this one matches is because it meets those criteria, right? It has this sort of date format and then something after the dash. This one doesn't match because it doesn't have that last dash right after the date. It has a slash, but not the dash. So again, very small differences make a big change in terms of what pages are included or not included. So it's always good to double check. All right, let's look at the user segment card again, at the all versus any logic. So we talked about this in both the pages card and in the user segment cards. It appears plenty of places in Composer. And again, the best way to think about it is and versus or logic. So all of is and, any one of is or. And in the pages card, right, again, it's only applying between the sections, so between URLs and tags and zones and content author and things like that. But within the section, it's or, unless there's something that's excluded, in which case that's and. And it gets complicated when we talk about having no access to resources or terms, things like that. So let's look at some examples of this. We looked at one example in my setup, but let's say in this example, I want to target users who already have an account, they're registered, but they don't have an active paid subscription, and I want to target them with an offer, right? An offer to pay for a subscription. So that's sort of what I did previously, right? Again, I want to note that in this case, I've said that they have access to this resource that represents registration, but again, depending on your setup, you might not need that, or there might be other ways that users can be registered or logged in without having access to the registration resource. So just consider that as you're setting this up. So with this example, I have the toggle set to all of, so it should be saying only users that have no access to the Daily World resource, the Daily World Premium, and have no access to the Daily World Premium, but do have access to this registration resource. They meet the criteria and they pass on to the next step. So for example, with that same setup, if a user with access to both the registration and the standard resource, right, the Daily World resource, if they come to my site, they should not meet the criteria for this, and they should not see whatever offer is at the end of this branch, right? So that's what I want to happen. That's the intended goal. On the other hand, let's look at another example. So in this example, I have the logic toggle turned to any one of, so or. And that means that as long as a user doesn't have access to at least one of these resources, they do meet the criteria for this experience branch, right, for this card. So users with only the registration resource, in this case, because that's included here, they would actually see the same experience as users with only the premium access or the, whatever the other resources are. So I can't think of an example when you would really want to do that in most cases, but there probably are some examples. So with that setup, again, if a user comes to the site and they have access to, let's see, the user has access to the Daily World registration and the Daily World resource, but they don't have access to premium, they actually do meet the criteria. Because again, it doesn't care what they have access to, it's only looking at what they don't have access to. And in this case, I've said or, so as long as they don't have access to at least one, they pass. So they would meet the criteria for this branch. Okay. So we didn't set up an everyone else segment, but I did want to highlight this because I did do something that is similar in terms of making my user segments exclusive. So another common mistake that folks often make in Composer is having overlapping user segments. And using the everyone else segment card can help you avoid that. So the reason, again, why you don't want to have overlapping segments as much as possible is that, especially if you're showing modals, Composer is only going to be able to show one modal at a time, right? So it's going to choose if there is an overlap, if there's a conflict, it's going to decide which one to show, but it might not be the one that you want. So it's important to try and make things exclusive so that you have direct control over what Composer is showing. So when you create a new segment, you have this option to target everyone else. And by doing this, you target everyone that hasn't already been targeted in previous user segments. So if you already have other user segments built out in the experience, and this is the last one that you configure with your everyone else option, you're making sure that you don't miss anybody, right? So everyone is being targeted by this experience in various ways. And you actually haven't missed any cross section of your audience if you include this everyone else option. So this can be really useful for a number of reasons. You might just want this so that you are tracking how many people are actually not going through the experience, right, are not seeing an offer. And you want to make sure as a fail-safe that you actually, maybe you thought you set up your user segments in your experience to cover everybody and you thought everyone was going to see an offer, and you include this everyone else branch just as a fail-safe to see in reporting if anybody fell into that branch, right? If there was a gap in your setup. So it can be really useful for that purpose. And in that case, if you actually don't want to show anything to these everyone else users, if you're just using it for tracking purposes to make sure nobody fell through the cracks, you might use a non-site action card. And that would not do anything. That would just show you that you completed the branch. We'll talk a little bit more about these later when we talk about listening experiences too. But this is a great option just to make sure that you're not missing anybody. Alternatively, you might set up an everyone else branch and then sub-segment your users within that everyone else branch. So the screenshot might be a little bit small, but I'll sort of describe what's happening here. So let's say you have group A, which should see one action, and then groups B, C, and D, which should see other actions, different actions from each other, but you want them to never overlap with group A. So you can actually nest groups B, C, and D under an everyone else segment. And that means that they're exclusive from A, right? So rather than going in individually to groups B, C, and D and saying, exclude the criteria of A, exclude the criteria of A, exclude the criteria of A, you don't have to do that. You can just say, I have A set up and then everyone else, but then everyone else is broken into segments B, C, and D. And that makes sure that they're exclusive. So in this example, let's say I wanted to show a special offer to segment A, because maybe they came from a special referral source or something like that. And then I also want to segment, desktop, mobile, and tablet users who didn't come from that referral source. And I want them to see different offers on site, but I want to make sure that they're separate, right? I want to make sure that those desktop, mobile, and tablet users did not come from that referral source. So rather than having to go into each of those segments and exclude that referral source, I can say, I have the segment A for this referral source, show them an offer, and then everyone else, then separate that out into mobile, desktop, and tablet users and I know that they're exclusive. I'm seeing that there is a question, so I'll pause to answer that because it's relevant to this. So suppose you have a propensity model set up within your experience and you target unregistered/unknown users. Do you still need the everyone else segment when composing your experience? I'll say you almost never need the everyone else segment. It's just an option. It's a best practice I want you to sort of be aware of, right? Again, it can be used as a fail-safe to make sure that you're getting everyone, that everyone is included, if that's the type of experience that you want to have, right? An experience that everyone sees some version of, or, right, to make your segments exclusive. So you don't need it, but it is a good option if you're in a scenario where you want exclusive segments or you want to make sure that you're capturing everybody. Okay. We talked a little bit about the meter names, but I just wanted to reiterate that it is important to give your meters different names to uniquely identify them. Again, you might actually encounter a scenario where you want them to have the same name if you want them to increment at the same rate, but more often than not, if you're setting up different meters and different experiences or different user segment branches, just be conscious that if they have the same name, they will increment at the same rate. If they have different names, they are separate meters. So you can plan accordingly. And then I wanted to, even though we didn't use a show template card, I wanted to speak a little bit about the difference between the show offer action card and the show template card. And this is especially relevant if you use VX for checkout. You use the show offer cards to trigger that checkout. Right, this is the show offer card where it's attached to the offer, which has the terms, and you select a template, and this is what triggers that registration and payment screen. But if you use the show template card, it's never going to trigger that, right? You could use the show template card for lots of different things, right? Depending on your setup. You could use it for directing users to a third-party checkout, right? For if you don't use VX, you might use it to display marketing messages like advertising an event. You could use it to perform actions that don't require converting on a term, like disabling ad blockers. So there's all sorts of things that you can do with the show template card. It is useful, but it will never trigger an offer, right? So if you want users to register, subscribe, pay for something, create an account, right? You need a show offer card. And then finally, one very common mistake is that you didn't turn it on, right? So always make sure that your experience is turned on, but more than that, make sure that it's not only live, but you also have the appropriate version selected. So again, versioning, super useful. Highly recommend saving as new version so you can go back, especially if you have live experiences that you're working on. This is great so that you can make changes as things are live. This is also useful if like you have a promotion that you want to offer and it's a slight adjustment to an experience that you already have. Rather than creating a whole new experience, you can just adjust the existing experience, save it as a new version, and then when the promotion ends, just go back to the original version, right? So if the promotion is version 7, you could just go back to version 6 where the promotion didn't exist. So really helpful to be aware of this versioning, both in the experiences and in the templates. And then obviously setting it live, right? Make sure you turn it on. If you're not seeing it, that might be why. It's sort of the obvious answer, but again, they sort of, it's hidden a little bit. So if it's not where you're expecting it, or you're seeing it, you're not seeing it where you're expecting to see it, always double check that the status is turned to live. Okay, great. So I want to definitely give you guys time to practice on your own. So now is the time to do it. Let's spend maybe 10 minutes on this activity where you will create your own metered paywall experience, play around with the different meter settings. I didn't get too specific in the tasks here because we went over a lot and I want you to sort of be able to play with it as you like. But you should create a metered experience, show different offers to different user segments, and then play around with the A/B split test as well. So here are the instructions. Carolina's also posting them in the chat. You should already have your numbers. They should be the same. If they're not, or if you don't have your number, you can let us know in the chat. So let's spend around 10 minutes going through this, and then we'll talk about listening experiences. Seeing that some folks in the chat are having issues with the login, I'll reiterate the troubleshooting steps that Carolina just posted that we've shared before. Always a good idea to try a new browser. So if you're in Safari, try using Chrome or Firefox or Edge, something where your cookies are a little bit cleaner. You can clear your cache and cookies in your existing browser. And then always a good idea, just double check, especially if you're copying and pasting, that everything is correct, that there's no additional like space at the end of something like the password, something like that. I'll go ahead and double check on my end to make sure that everything is all good. You're also always welcome to do these exercises in your own sandbox environment. I just wanted to give everybody the option to play around in an environment that's maybe a little cleaner than your own sandbox environment, or where you won't mess anything up. So if you're able and willing to do things in your sandbox, that's great. Otherwise, we'll try and get these login issues resolved. One other note for those that are still having issues, if you have multiple incognito windows open, you might need to close all of them. That's what I just did, and it resolved the issue for me. And it can also help to not have the test website, so the ba.piano.io/Piano Academy, right? Have that open somewhere else, right? So not in the same window. That might help as well. I mean, I'm seeing at least a couple experiences in there, so I know folks were able to get in. Hopefully those troubleshooting tips helped. We'll take maybe 2 more minutes. I know that's not a lot of time to play around with this experience, but you can certainly continue playing around with it after the fact. Just want to make sure that we're on time today. So I'll give everybody maybe two more minutes. All right. Awesome. Hopefully some of you at least have had a chance to play around a little bit. You'll you're welcome to continue playing around after the session as well. We have about 5 more minutes left in this, so I wanted to make sure that we can also talk about listening experiences. So I'm going to go ahead and continue. If you feel like you can multitask and set up your experience and also listen, that's great. Otherwise, I invite you to come back to the presentation. So as you've seen, in most cases, Composer does something, right? You show an action on the site, you trigger checkout, registration, show an offer, things like that. But even when Composer doesn't execute any action on the site, it can still be useful. So I wanted to talk about these types of experiences that we call listening or monitoring experiences, because they operate in the background, right? They allow you to use Composer's reporting tools to analyze behavior on your site without actually altering the user experience. So these can be super helpful. You can use them for a number of different things. I'm sure there's way more than just on this list, but here are some examples. You might want to understand how your audience is consuming content on your site and ask questions like, are enough users being shown the paywall? Should the meter be lower to service the paid offer more frequently? So you could set up a listening experience for that. Or maybe you want to keep track of the size of your audience in each segment based on things like user frequency, interest category, propensity, and more. Those things using the C1X and LTX targeting. You can also set up experiences that monitor how far users are scrolling on important pages like the homepage or the subscription landing page to sort of optimize the layout of that page. Or maybe you just want to track how long users are spending on the homepage to help you increase engagement and recirculation. So those are just some examples. Some of them are more complicated than others. Really, you can use it for whatever you like, but it's a good idea to set at least one up. And I mentioned the non-site action cards for the everyone else experience branch, but for these listening experiences, this is really important because these are the action cards that don't actually do anything on site, right? So if you have a listening experience that isn't intended to actually do anything or affect the user experience on site, you want to finish those branches with these non-site action cards. And these can be used to execute actions outside of Composer because they trigger a JavaScript event that you can listen for on the site, or you can simply use them to say, I didn't actually forget to add an action on the end of this branch. I meant to do nothing, right? This was intentional. This is my non-site action card. So you can use it for tracking with those, JavaScript events, or you can use it to just say, do nothing. So here's an example of a listening experience in Composer. So in this example, it's a little bit more complex, but we're monitoring anonymous users from various devices that do not have an ad blocker enabled. And we want to see how many page views these users are consuming. So we've actually set up a page view meter that essentially does not expire. And on the first page view, we want to see how far these visitors scroll down on the page. So we have a scroll depth event cards for various pixel thresholds set up there. And then each branch ends in a non-site action card and then offers a detailed view into the traffic and activity on site. So what this looks like in the reporting, in the flow report, this is where you can get those valuable insights into the user behavior, which help identify potential improvements, and you can sort of track the performance of different versions of the Composer experience using this report. The flow report is helpful because it actually visualizes the total number of executions for every card in your Composer experience, and you can therefore see how many users are satisfying the conditions of each card in each branch, sort of like a funnel. This can be really helpful for revealing certain bottlenecks or maybe just opportunities in the experience logic. And I like this report because it replicates the exact structure of the Composer canvas itself. So it also shows the percentage of users who converted after different cards and things like that. So you can really drill into a lot of details. It's a good report for a visual person like me, And again, this is another reason why it's really helpful to name your cards as you're setting things up, because in then reporting, it makes it a lot easier to come in and see what each branch is doing. So that's it for today. We're at time almost exactly. I wanted to leave you all with, again, some additional resources, including the Piano Training Center, where you can take online courses and test your knowledge, the best practices site, which requires you to have a dashboard login, but I think most of you do. So you can use that to review some best practices from our strategic services and data science teams. Again, really helpful if you're setting up A/B split tests and things like that. And then finally, the feature playbook, we can just easily browse different collections of content on our doc site. So to wrap up, we covered a lot today. We almost didn't have enough time, so I do encourage you to continue practicing on your own, continue investigating and reading documentation. But hopefully by now, you should be able to understand and avoid some common mistakes. You should be able to create an experience with multiple user segment cards, and a page meter settings. Hopefully you can apply those naming conventions and best practices that we talked about in your experience builds and use multiple show action cards, including the show offer and the show template card, and know the difference between those two things. Hopefully you had a chance to set up an A/B split test and play around with that. And we also talked about the difference between live and active versions and a little bit about those monitoring experiences. That's what we covered today. Hopefully this was helpful. As always, I would love your feedback. Please scan the QR code, or Carolina, thank you for posting the link in the chat. So you can use that to submit your feedback about this course, and this helps us improve our training offerings to better suit your needs. So I really appreciate all the feedback, the participation, and I look forward to seeing you all next time where we talk about troubleshooting and debugging. All right. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day.